If you like the video, then please consider supporting Slopes Game Room on Patreon. You know what always interested me? Sega and the history of video games. Obviously, which is why, like most people in the same boat, this little thing, called opa-opa, made its way onto my radar. It's one of those first facts you learn and the ultimate trick question you ask people that have a brief interest in gaming's past. In fact, it's the perfect way to quickly gauge just how nerdy they are. Do you know who Sega's first mascot was? Nope. Nope. Ah, there you go. Well, actually that's not true either, as I previously mentioned on this very channel. Plug. Regardless, opa-opa and the Fantasy Zone games are a huge and, more importantly, an integral part of Sega's forgotten past that helped build up the company into what they are most known for today. And although nowadays I know who this Sega mascot is, back in the day I didn't. And heck, I don't even think I ever played on the classic Master System game either. But let's be honest, the box art isn't exactly all that intriguing, is it? So, join me as I earn myself one of the more important badges on my Sega Club Scouts uniform, as we take on this Fantasy Zone journey together and fly deep into this game's history, its development, its origins, and of course, its games. Welcome to Slopes Game Room. Fantasy Zone. If you haven't played it, do yourself a favour and go and pick up the classic Master System and Mark III game. Easily one of the very best games on the whole system, and a game that I am truly gutted I didn't know about in my early Master System days. A game that is incredibly simple to understand, brutally hard very early on, but most importantly is as addictive as some of Sega's most important arcade classics. But hold up, as good as this game is at being the vast majority of the world's first experience into the world of Fantasy Zone, it's not the first game. Of course it's bloody not, it's a Sega game after all, which basically means it's a port of a much better arcade version. And with that, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. Here we are, back to one of my more desirable time travel periods and locations. 1985, in a dark, dingy Japanese arcade. I can only imagine how exciting this time must have felt, never knowing what new arcade machine would appear when you next turned up, bringing new styles of gameplay to the table, and in quite a few instances, getting to try out some of the most legendary games ever created firsthand. Now, this was obviously not always the case, but that's cool too, because when a game like Scramble was released back in the early 80s, which was a huge hit among arcade goers, not only do other companies come along and for better or worse rip it off with rather questionable results and mostly forgettable results, but even Konami themselves, the people that made the game, did try their best to outdo their own creation. Which brings us back to 1985 with the classic game that is Gradius. This is sort of a sequel to this, and more importantly for this episode, this game exploded in popularity even more than this one did. But what does this all have to do with Sega? Well, for every original idea that the company had, they too was guilty of creating their own versions of classic games put out by other companies. But the difference is, quite a lot of the time, they did it better. When Namco did Pole Position, Sega responded with Hang On. When Namco did Mappy, Sega smashed out Flicky. And like I said, when Konami did Gradius and Sega saw that it was taking off in the arcades, they needed a game to take it on. Now obviously you can look at this from a fairly negative point of view, but honestly, everyone was doing it, and it's something that still happens to this very day, with several driving first-person shooters and one-on-one fighters coming out practically every month. But the difference here is that Sega attempted to make a similar styled game that looked totally different, and dare I say it, even better.
Presented by Konami. Get these ready.
This is the guy that was tasked with the job of taking on Konami's smash hit. His boss gave him one very simple instruction.
Make me a Gradius killer.
And by using the Sega System 16 hardware, which was the first game to do so by the way, he got to work doing that exact thing. The original pitch from the boss was to create a game that was incredibly similar to Gradius, as well as 500 other copycats out there. Make it full of star fields with a heavy space theme, you get the idea. But that wasn't Yoji's style. Worried that doing this will make the game look incredibly bland, he directed his staff to use pastel-like colours in an attempt to make it stand out among the competition. On top of this, changing the usual sci-fi sounding soundtracks to a more Brazilian styled upbeat theme would also make the game stand out amongst the competition, and the concept was pushed even further when they named this thing. In Brazil, opa is something that is shouted when people get excited, hence the name opa-opa. Mixing that with the bright colours, all Samba de Amigo style music resulted in a style that we are all too familiar with. In fact, the game at one point was even going to be called Opa-Opa, before changing to the somewhat hard to read Fantasy Zone. Anyway, that's enough about the design. What about the gameplay? Fantasy Zone isn't your typical shooter. Just like the game Defender that came out before it, you don't simply go in one direction, but instead you choose the direction in a never-ending loop of several screens. Although, this concept didn't actually come from Gradius, but it came from Yoji's earlier game, Flicky, and even earlier than that, Sega's often forgotten game, Droll. On top of this, Yoji wasn't exactly the best at typical shooter games like the ones that inspired the game in the first place. And along with the work it out yourself style of gameplay, another big chunk of the inspiration actually came from Pac-Man. This is why on each level of Fantasy Zone you need to defeat several bases before the boss appears, similar to how Pac-Man needs to collect all the dots before he moves on too. And yet another big change up was the addition of a shop to upgrade your ship. Most other shooters wanted you to grab power-ups as you fly, but as Yoji was actually a big fan of upgrading his own car, he decided to use that same concept in the game with currency that you have to pick up yourself, in an attempt to give off the same sort of feeling. Anyway, about 6 months later, and whilst another team was working on this game, Fantasy Zone was finally released in the arcades, and of course, it was an absolute smash hit. And, well, let's see why that is, shall we? Fantasy Zone is a must-play. Many games have replicated this game, and like I said, this game replicated others. But for me, it's hard to come across a game that is this unique. Its art style slaps you in the face with all its gooey goodness of an 80s Care Bear special, and it's obvious to see why this character has resonated with video game fans for so long, including the ones that haven't even played the game. But thankfully, it's not the case of style over substance. We got a lot of games to get through, and with this being the first one in the series, well, they nailed it. 8 worlds of base destroying, opa-opa upgrading, and brilliantly designed bosses, ending on the game's big twist where you have to actually fight your own dad, which by the way is an obvious nod to Star Wars.
Opa-opa the player has now destroyed the invading army and restored peace to the Fantasy Zone. However, he has mixed emotions because his long-lost father was chief of the enemy forces. One burning question that will remain with him until his dying days: was my victory really worth the price I had to pay?
Yeah, random storylines aside, there's really not much else that needs to be said. It's simple, but solid, just like the majority of Sega's classic arcade games, and when you do eventually pick it up, you will have a tough time putting it down. Now, there are quite a few ports of the game. Obviously, I already mentioned the Master System version, which was my first discovering of the game. Good, but not as good, as it's missing the all-important mini-map, and a couple of the bosses are completely gone. You got two versions on Nintendo's 8-bit wonder, one by Sunsoft and one by Tengen, with the Sunsoft version giving the Master System a run for its money with the inclusion of that mini-map. But the Tengen version looks absolutely awful and is easily probably the very worst port of the game. However, I've been playing this version the most recently, the PC Engine port. It's the closest to the arcade and it's really not that bad at all. There's plenty more too. You got the abysmal MSX and MZ versions, which are both horrific, but the X68000 version is almost perfect and even includes a hidden stage based on Space Harrier. And then of course you've got all of the other random ports found on classic collections from the Sega Saturn onwards. But by this point, you're pretty much getting perfect emulation almost all of the time. If you are desperate for the best arcade port, then, my opinion, just go and get the Saturn version. Right, that's enough about that game. Great fun and well worth playing, but so is the sequel. Moving away from the arcade, Sega decided to make the sequel a Master System original title. And here it is. Fantasy Zone 2 Tears of Opa-Opa changed to simply Fantasy Zone 2 outside of Japan. Straight away you can see that the game is far more brighter than the original, pushing aside the pastel colours before it and instead this time going for a more bolder look and feel. However, that's not the only change. Sure, all the usual traits from the original are here, but this time, when you're blowing up a base, you're more likely going to be seeing one of these blue warp zones. You keep destroying them until you have done them all. Go inside one of them and do it all again. You do this over and over until you're lucky enough to find a red warp zone. By which point you should have actually built up a decent amount of funds. Spend them on whatever you fancy and defeat that level's boss. Now, personally, the music doesn't really do anything for me, especially after coming off that original game. And overall, the game is still fun, however, it's just not as good as the original. Thankfully, Sega decided to create a version of the game for the arcades. But it's quite a messy history. You see, because this is not a port, but this is. Okay, let me explain. Originally, the first arcade version came out on the Sega System E arcade board, which for all intents and purposes for this video is based on Master System hardware. This version is a port, with the only real noticeable addition being the inclusion of the all-important radar, making it better than the original Mark III and Master System edition. However, if you want the far superior arcade version, then you're going to want to play this one. This arcade version was built from the ground up on the original Sega System 16 hardware, but it is sort of not a port. This version instead was a complete reworking of the original game, with the goal being, what would Fantasy Zone 2 be like if it was made on this more powerful original game's hardware? And the answer is bloody brilliant! You see, fans of the series always felt a little betrayed, as the sequel, which technically should have improved the original's formula, seemed more like a step back, as it had the Master System in mind from the get-go. Fans wanted a proper sequel that was at least as good as the original, if not better, and all they got was this pretty good game in all fairness, and obviously a couple of terrible ports on the MSX and Famicom between 1987 and 1989. And although it took Sega a whole 20 years to answer fans' requests, yes, this version came out in 2008, you gotta give them their due, they finally done it. There are a few other additions too. Obviously the radar is here once again, but on top of that, when you go through warp zones, you actually change the scenery from dark to light, similar to the whole future and past mechanic in Sonic CD. Depending on what variation you complete a level in, you will actually end the game on one of 3 separate endings. The whole thing is pretty damn impressive if you ask me, making this the ultimate version of number 2. And if you want to play this on your home console, you'll be happy to hear that you can buy the Sega Ages Collection Volume 33. Oh no, we're not finished with this one yet. This is 3D Fantasy Zone 2W, and thankfully it's based on this version and not this version. But the screen has widened, the 3D is obviously outstanding as all of the Sega remakes are. You got the new Link Loop Land mode, which works as a sort of endless score attack, and all in all, everything just feels perfectly refined. It's taken a long time since its original 1987 release, but in 2015, developer M2 has made pretty much the perfect Fantasy Zone 2 experience. In fact, if there is only one Fantasy Zone game that you intend to play, then in my opinion, this is the version to get. The very, very best Fantasy Zone game ever made. Although, if I'm gonna get nitpicky, I would have liked a trailer for possibly the best Fantasy Zone game ever to be like the Unknown Sunsoft's Japanese release. This is bloody weird, even by Sega standards. Look, just check this out. There are no words.
新発売やで。ファンタジーゾー2だで。ファンタジーゾー2。ファンタジーゾー2、新発売。買ってね。
ファンタジーゾーン2、ファミコンになって新登場。
サンソフト。
Right, we jumped about there a little bit, didn't we? Okay, so moving on to the third game, simply titled Opa-opa in Japan and Fantasy Zone the Maze everywhere else. As you may have guessed by the cover and title screen, this is not your standard Fantasy Zone game, other than the fact that it too came out on the Sega System E hardware as well as the Master System. Is more of a Pac-Man game than anything else. Touch dots, which is actually money. The bigger the money, the more it's worth. Upgrade your ship and move on. And that's really it. Blending both Fantasy Zone with the more popular arcade-like maze-styled games actually turns this into something quite unique. It may not look like much, but I can't deny it's as addictive as some of the best games in the maze genre. Next up is Galactic Protector. This is a weird one, as it's yet again a Japan-only game that uses the Master System's paddle controller. Why this controller and not the original? Well, just look at it. Not much really needs to be said about this one either. It's obviously completely different than the originals, and if you want to play it, then the only real way you're going to be doing it is by picking up that Fantasy Zone Complete collection on the PS2 that I mentioned earlier. Ah yes, this one's bloody interesting. Space Fantasy Zone, the NEC-produced game that was slated for release in 1991, and had plenty of buzz around it, constantly appearing in magazine articles leading up to its cancellation. Yep, the game never officially came out, although it is believed to be finished. This is a leaked prototype that appeared on the WWWs several years later. And it's either completely finished or just about there. Now, Super Fantasy Zone is one of these rare instances that two different games try and cross over in an attempt to connect two worlds. You see, this game is attempting to connect both Space Harrier and, obviously, Fantasy Zone. Now, looking online reviews of the unreleased game, well, they're not great. However, I actually had quite a bit of fun with this one. But then again, that could be just because I'm a massive Sega fanboy and I was oozing with excitement to play this one. Plus, the awesome mashup style music of both Fantasy Zone and Space Harrier is amazing. Just listen to this. Ah, yes. So good. Yeah, I know it's all about the gameplay, and yeah, I guess it's where the game does fall down a little. It's not horrific, in fact it's completely playable. The problem is, it's just not as good as this. And it's not as good as this. It's a surprising addition to the list, but it's not anything to write home about. However, with all that said, if you are a fan of classic Sega games, then I think it's incredibly important to at least give this one a go. Why didn't it come out? Well, no one knows for sure. The biggest opinions on this, and let's be honest, both are completely credible, is that Sega had some legal issues going on with NEC at the time, and or they just wasn't completely happy with how the game looked or felt. Next up is one for Game Gear players. Yep, they even had a go with Opa-opa, and what's awesome is that it's not just a simple port of one of these games. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Fantasy Zone Gear Opa-opa Jr. no Buken. Well, that's what it was known as in Japan. Everywhere else, it was confusingly titled Fantasy Zone. That is until you turn on the title screen where it's called Fantasy Zone Gear. Right, okay, so obviously the game is incredibly limited on a Game Gear and all, but it's actually so much better than you would expect, and it's well worth trying. Yes, it's obviously not as good as the originals, and yet again no mini-map radar thing, but would you look at this? The devs took it upon themselves to make this game use as many colours as the Game Gear would let them. This is a surprisingly great game for Sega's little handheld wonder, and it's fully worth checking out, even if the boss battles are incredibly easy, and obviously due to the system they're on, well, they're a tad bland. Right, that's enough about the 8-bit generations, let's take Opa-opa into the world of 16-bits. And this is Super Fantasy Zone for the classic Mega Drive. And yes, I say Mega Drive with pride, as it was never physically released in North America, and the only way you was ever going to play it was via the Sega channel. Now, what's actually not too surprising if you think about it, is the fact that this game was actually produced by Sunsoft. You know, the guys behind the arguably better versions on the Famicom. This is obviously everything you would expect from a Fantasy Zone game. 8 levels, plenty of bases to kill before you fight an array of cute but hard as balls bosses. I just can't praise this game enough. Besides the remakes that are still to be released by this point in time, this is arguably one of the best home console releases in the series. The music is amazing, the graphics have boosted up, and overall, it's just an awesome little package that is well worth adding to your collection. Plus, you can actually unlock the original arcade soundtrack if you know what you're doing. And there you go, guys, a whole heap of Fantasy Zone goodness, pretty much all of which is fully worth checking out, with the 3DS sequel, the original, which is also on the 3DS might I add, and the Mega Drive ports being the cream of the crop. However, as this little thing was briefly a mascot for one of gaming's biggest and most well-known companies, as you would expect, Sega has had plenty of fun continuing to slap him in yo face. There is just still so much. You got the no doubt awful J2ME mobile game, which I sadly couldn't find any footage of. There's the Pocket Boy game. You got Fantasy Zone Neo Classic, which is only available via Volume 3 of Sega Ages 2500, and is basically an enhanced version of Sunsoft's Famicom game with better graphics and brighter colours. Then of course on Volume 3 of the same series, there is the PlayStation 2 remake of the original arcade game. It's a lot easier and is full of cel-shaded graphics. Surprisingly, it's actually pretty good, and is definitely one of the very best remakes in this small selection. And finally, you got at least 2 redemption games. One being the 1999 cabinet, which sadly I cannot find anything other than this pixelated mess. And of course this one, which came out as recently as 2012. Basically a 4-player ticket redemption version of Galactic Protector, but with more Fantasy Zone theming of course. And that is everything game related to Opa-Opa, one of the most recognisable yet unknown classic Sega franchises ever made. So, next time you're playing Super Hang-On and you recognise that shop's theme tune, play as Opa-Opa in Sonic and All-Star Racing, find one of those capsules in Shenmue, see Opa-Opa pop up in Sonic Runners, pretty much all of the Phantasy Star games, unlock Opa-Opa in Planet Harriers, find Opa-Opa in Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars on the Master System, and dodge Opa-Opa shaded mini helicopters in Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, download the Opa-Opa DLC for Sonic Adventure 2 Racing, ride on the Opa-Opa shaped hoverboard in these crappy games, and of course, put Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf into your Mega Drive, get a game over after hitting 100 shots on a single stage, slapping the Konami code on the game over screen, and unlock one of the very worst endless versions of the game ever released, because, you know, that makes sense. You will now finally know this character's origins. I think it goes without saying that with this franchise I have no doubt missed the odd appearance, but come on, it doesn't get much better than this, does it? And sure, we could go into detail about the game's mostly unknown brief manga series and appearance in the Zillion anime, but instead, I'm just going to end with this. If by now you're still not sure if Fantasy Zone is for you, then it's probably not. And for everyone else, well, now you know. In my opinion, this series is fully worth checking out. I know I've said that a lot in this episode, but it's true. There is just so much addictive fun to be had here. Don't let the colourful set pieces fool you. Fantasy Zone is worthy of its reputation of passing on that Sega mascot crown. And in an alternative universe where a certain blue spiny mammal never existed, I would have been proud for Opa-Opa to lead the way to the Fantasy Zone. Oh, and by the way, for those wondering what that 16-ton weight used in the game is a reference to, well, get ready for this. It's not only bizarrely a reference to this Mel Travis tune, but more importantly to this awesome Monty Python gag. Hey there guys, thanks for checking out the video. I want to give a big special shout out to all of my Patreons, with a special shout out going to Ryan Burford, Brent Craft, Andrew Dalton, Joe Lazarezi, N.A. Chapman, Phil Lowlins, Conrad, Constantine, Pretendo64, Mike Fallon, Retro to Next Gen, Zane Powers, Gavin's In The Zone, Creamy Elephant, James Loveridge, Casey Garner, Blitz, Hedgie, Ben Hall, Taylor Armand, Gemma at Mr. T-Shirts, Rob Jenkins, The Geeky Dad, Red the Beard, John Fuller, Richard Carter, aka Fantastic Dizzy, Dunder Control, Michael, Todd Poolfloat G, Petty Mew, and Brian Rawson. If you want to be part of this list, get your name shouted out, get your name shown, come and see what I'm working on, and plenty of other things, click the link that you see on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, a thumbs down, whatever you prefer, and also, I've just opened up my Discord to everyone, so please do come and check it out. Link in the description. But for now, this is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.